Well, here we are, 96 years later, 96 and a half years later, October of 2018. I've said to friends that you have memories of Pearl Harbor and then another tragic day in the 21st century, 9/11, 2001. You saw them both. What is your assessment of where we are as a country, as a civilization, and where do you think we're going?
That's a tough question, Dave. I can remember the early part of my life better than predicting what's going on from here. But actually, speaking of the early part of my life, it goes back literally to horse and buggy days. Not many of them, but I can remember as a boy growing up in a house on Kellogg Street that our milk was delivered daily by horse and wagon. And the milkman would stop the horse and wagon and jump out with a carrier full of milk bottles and leave whatever we needed on the front porch of the house, and then go back to the wagon, and the horse would go to the next house. And at that time, many farms were operated with farm animals, mostly horses, and
those rural areas would have no electricity.
In the very rural areas, there was no electricity. That's true, and things like threshing. Old threshing machine would go from one farm to the next and be operated by farmers and their neighbors to thresh wheat, for instance. And so those were very rural times, literally. And travel was slow. All long distance travel in those early days was by train. There were airplanes, but nothing commercial when I was very young. I didn't get my first plane ride until I was in junior college, and that was in a two-seater Piper Cub, because already at that time the government was sponsoring what was called civilian pilot training in order to have more aviators available in case of emergency than were being trained in military operations of the Army or Navy. There was no real Air Force back in those early days at that time. Came really during World War II and after that time.
But in general, an assessment of where we stand.
Actually, I guess you can call it the industrial century, because things progressed very rapidly. We went from cars with shifts on the floor to shifts on the steering wheel to automatic transmissions. We went from small, lightweight planes that could only hold 2 or a few people at the most to aerial transportation, commercial flying, in which commercial air transport for passengers was a very expensive operation, and people really dressed up to fly, wearing suits and coats and hats and ties, and women wore good clothing, and you got very nice meals on planes. And even then, though, they were slower, making more landings between from one city to another. Then they progressed to jet airplanes after World War II, and eventually put a man on the moon with spaceships. And so it's been an amazing advance in technology and industrialization and travel and digital advancements. I can remember in my early days in the refinery, when everything was measured by dials on the equipment. Now everything's measured digitally and operated digitally with remote operated valves and things of that sort to operate the refinery, and results all are printed out on computer printouts. And so it's been an amazing sequence of industrialization as far as I'm concerned. Where it will go from here, I can only not really imagine, because things are moving faster and faster. I myself have not really kept up with the latest digital things. I'm still using what's called a flip phone, which is a battery-operated telephone that I carry in my pocket, and you flip the top open to dial a phone number. And the newer ones now are open face and are really not so much phones anymore, but are miniature computers, and are much more a computer than some of the early ones, which sat in a big box on a desk.